Toge here again, and welcome back to the Mixed Reality Masterclass. So far in this series, we've looked at the basics of mixed reality capture using Live, and in this episode, we'll start to take this to the next level. I'll be going through everything you need to build a space like this, and a moving camera rig for mixed reality. I'll do this by showing all the steps that I have taken to get to this point, and all the iterations I've made to my setup, and the reasons why. If you're looking to improve the quality of your mixed reality capture, or perhaps build a tracked camera rig, this video should arm you with the information you need to do just that. Welcome to Mixed Reality Masterclass, Episode 2, Studio and Camera Rig Build.
Baby, I got you. Baby, I got you.
To go from my fairly typical mixed reality streaming setup with a static camera to a fully fledged tracked camera setup, the first thing I needed to consider was the size of the space that I was using. To fully make use of a tracked camera, I needed floor-to-ceiling and wall-to-wall green. The corner muslin sheet setup I was using would have been too limiting, so I needed to expand. The decision was made to make the entire room green, expanding the play space to 3.8 by 3.3 metres. This change meant that everything that was in this room, including the PC that runs it all, had to move into the next room. Now, not long before this, we had actually knocked down some walls separating these two rooms. Originally, this was done to accommodate the 3 Degree of Freedom motion simulator I built for VR racing sims. But with this relegated to the garage, I was free to convert these two rooms into one big space dedicated to mixed reality. This extra space was critical because with a tracked camera setup, you not only need to consider the space you're playing in, but also the space that the camera will be moving in. Because it needs to be tracked too, just the same as your headset and controllers. If anything, the camera needs an even bigger space to move in than where you'll be playing. While my SteamVR play space is 3.8 metres wide and 3.3 metres deep, with the additional area for the camera, this bumps up to almost 9 metres deep. I've even added an additional lighthouse base station to make sure the camera has good tracking throughout. This extra tracked area gives us the flexibility to go from close up to these super wide shots and anywhere in the middle. With the space prepared, it was time to board up the windows and paint the room. The paint we used was this Roscoe Chroma Key green. We put down primer first, and then 4 coats of the green to get a consistent finish. It took almost 2 gallons to cover the walls and ceiling. The proper Chroma Key green paint is a little expensive, but I would recommend using it over regular interior paint. One of the important things with this paint is the very flat, matte finish. It's not going to reflect your lights in any weird ways and create keying dramas for you in post. In fact, without much light on this paint, you'll notice the green is actually quite dull, not fluorescent like you'd expect. If you're looking for a lower cost option than the Roscoe paint, try to keep this in mind when choosing the colour. For the floor, I was able to repurpose the green muslin sheet I was using on the walls in my old setup. Because the PlaySpace floor is carpet, the fabric can actually work quite well and doesn't slip. I firstly trimmed the sheet to size, then ironed out all of the wrinkles. To fix it to the floor, I used this matte Chroma Key green tape and stretched the sheet tight over the floor. Initially, I did not expect this sheet to be on the floor for very long, but it's been down for almost 2 years now and is still in excellent shape. There are other options out there, such as Roscoe's Chromafloor vinyl, but the cost there was a bit prohibitive for me. I did investigate other options, from carpets to custom gym flooring to just painting the concrete underneath, but ultimately settled for the muslin sheet over carpet, and it's been working great. Acoustically, it works quite well too. Whenever I use the space for streaming and need a microphone, the carpet is much more effective at catching those empty room echoes than a harder surface like vinyl or concrete would. Now that I had a much bigger green screen than before, I needed to increase the amount of light that I was throwing at it. To begin with, I kept the 2 softboxes I was using in the previous setup, and also added a pair of 500 LED panels to the ceiling. This was more than sufficient to begin with, but as my setup and workflow evolved, it became necessary to add a lot more lighting. I'll go into these changes a little bit later. To make the space work, I had to condense my PC setup and make it flexible enough to suit a range of different scenarios and camera angles in the room. I squeezed my whole setup onto this standing desk that I added wheels to that allow it to be positioned anywhere within the space. The only attachment to the desk is this one loom that contains power and Ethernet. And more recently, I added an output to a subwoofer, which I need for reasons. The flexibility of this setup allows it to easily transition between video editing, streaming, or to maximise the tracked area for the camera. A limiting factor for a mixed reality camera rig can be the length of cable attached to it. There's only so far you can reliably run HDMI signals. So for me it was important to have the ability to reposition the PC anywhere within the space to suit the types of shots I wanted to get. And speaking of mixed reality camera rigs, when building an MR camera that you can actually move, you need to consider there are actually two cameras involved. There's the real-world camera, which could be your GoPro, DSLR, or mirrorless camera. And then there's the virtual camera, or the in-game camera. To move these two cameras together, you're going to need one of these, a Vive tracker. The Vive tracker is what we'll be tying the virtual camera to in Live. Now you don't specifically need to use a Vive tracker for this purpose. You can use any other Lighthouse tracked controller like a Vive wand or index controller, but it does need to be Lighthouse based. Unfortunately, Oculus does not have a unified tracking system that can be used for this. Inside-out tracking really is a step backwards in this regard. I do have a method for having a tracked camera with non-Lighthouse headsets, like the Oculus Quest, but this is a much bigger topic which I'll cover in a later masterclass episode, so subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss that. My first MR camera rig consisted of a GoPro 7 Black, which I made up a bracket to attach the Vive tracker to, and bolted it all together on this 7-inch monitor. The monitor is a Lilliput A7S, which has a native res of 1920 by 1200 at 60 Hz, but I just run it at 1920 by 1080. This monitor is actually just used as an additional monitor attached to the PC that I output the Live composite to. This is incredibly useful as a viewfinder when shooting mixed reality. The other important thing to note about the Lilliput A7S is that it is capable of accepting a 4K 60 signal. The ability to have a 4K Live composite window will be critical for when we start talking about manual MR composition in the next masterclass episode. I sat the camera rig on this Velbon tripod that I picked up because of its ability to extend quite high. I found that most cheaper tripods weren't tall enough to be useful for me. Then the rig is attached to the PC through a single loom containing all of the power and HDMI cables for the monitor and camera, about 5 meters in length. The length of this cable is really only limited by how far you can reliably run an HDMI signal, so you can go longer than 5 meters if you like, but that's all I needed to cover this space. This first camera rig worked great on a tripod, and for streaming it was really useful to be able to quickly reposition the camera without having to worry about recalibration. However, when it came to using it off tripod, handheld like a normal camera, I very quickly learnt just how sensitive to vibration the Vive trackers are. It was almost impossible to get a steady shot. It became very obvious that some stabilisation would be required if I wanted to move the camera. Of course, many cameras will have some form of image stabilisation inbuilt, but with a mixed reality camera, you cannot rely on this, as you need to be able to apply the same stabilisation to both the real and virtual cameras together. I decided that adding a gimbal would be the best way to achieve this. The gimbal I went with was the DJI Ronin SC, with a dual hand grip from SmallRig. This gimbal is normally designed for mirrorless cameras, but the GoPro mounted up to it just fine, along with the Vive tracker on a little aluminium bracket I made up. I also mounted a phone to the payload on this gimbal in order to take advantage of the Ronin SC's automatic subject tracking capability. This is a pretty cool trick to use live on Twitch, but certainly not without issue. Let me know in the comments down below if you'd like to see a video on how to make this automatic tracking camera rig for mixed reality. It was around this point that I shot my first MR trailer, which was the Synth Riders Oculus Quest launch trailer. This was all done with this GoPro-based camera rig, and I guess the GoPro was probably punching above its weight here. The quality was acceptable, but for me it left a little bit to be desired, and it really wasn't flexible enough for a professional filmmaking environment. As I started to do more work in MR trailers for VR games, my ambition outgrew the GoPro, and I began looking for other options. I settled on the Panasonic GH5, which is a mirrorless camera with a micro four thirds lens mount. This was the biggest and best camera body I could fit on the existing Ronin SC gimbal. One of the things I love about the GH5 is its ability to just record and keep recording non-stop all day without ever overheating. Something to keep in mind when choosing a camera is that because with Live your camera is outputting over HDMI constantly, this is working the camera pretty hard, which can cause it to overheat. so do your research on this topic before choosing a camera. The other thing that drew me to the GH5 was that it could shoot in a flat or log colour profile that gives a lot of dynamic range and better control when colour grading in post. It also supports in-body LUTs that you can apply to the monitor and HDMI output, which is a great way to get some colour correction and grading done before it reaches live. I'm using an in-body LUT that RageSack put together for me, thank you RageSack, which does a basic correction to something more resembling Rec 709, but also boosts and flattens out the greens to make getting a good key that much easier. The lens I'm using on the GH5 is a Leica 8 to 18mm zoom lens with a max aperture range of f2.8 to f4. That may sound really wide, but keep in mind that micro four thirds is a 2x crop factor, so the full frame equivalent for this lens would be 16mm to 36mm. This has been my go-to lens for mixed reality, as it has the capability to go very wide, but has very little in the way of distortion, even all the way at 8mm. Cheaper wide-angle lenses may suffer from this distortion. Being a zoom lens as well has been great for shoots where I've needed to change between focal lengths, as it just takes a twist of the zoom ring and a quick recalibration in live. I don't need to worry about changing lenses and rebalancing the gimbal, it's just easy. After a couple of months long teething period, the GH5 setup was working great, but I was starting to do more work on MR trailers, which meant more manual MR composition. This means that I don't rely on the live composition at all, but record the camera footage separately and build the MR composition manually in post. This is a massive topic in itself that I'll start to break down in the next masterclass episode. But what it did highlight to me was a big shortcoming in my setup, and that was lighting. As I began to manually key my green screen footage in post, I really started to struggle with shadows, getting a decent exposure without a lot of noise, and being able to make my lighting match the in-game lighting. Really, the goal with mixed reality should be to make the effect as believable as possible, and lighting will go a long way to achieve this. My first step in upgrading lighting was to double the number of big 500 LED panels from 2 to 4. And then I added 8 smaller 170 LED panels to fill in around the border. These smaller LED panels do a fantastic job of combating the shadow issue I was having when trying to key my footage in post. Depending on the situation, I will also sometimes put the softboxes back in, usually to fill from underneath. A VR headset can cast a shadow over your face, which is usually unwanted, so the fill from underneath was great to fix this. Additionally, I added a pair of RGB stage lights, which have been a great way of adding a little bit of colour when needed. They can also act as strobe lights, which is a cool effect that I'd like to explore more. You do have to be a little bit careful when using coloured lights in a green screen scenario, as if you shine them too brightly on the green screen, it will no longer be a green screen, and your key will just break. And you definitely can't make them shine green, as you'll just disappear. More recently, I've been using a pair of these RGB light wands, which have been great as a flexible light source I can position anywhere in the space as needed. Say for example in Beat Saber, you could position one either side of you, set to blue and red to match the colours of your sabers. This would be a subtle yet effective way of integrating you into the game world in a more believable way. So, looking to the future, what I'd like to explore next would be even more control over my lighting. Perhaps through the use of DMX lighting control as a method for dynamically changing lighting while recording. For games like Beat Saber and Synth Riders, perhaps a DMX plugin could be configured to automatically control lighting. That would be pretty cool. But ultimately here, I'm reaching the limit of the space I'm shooting in. Because this is just in my house and not a Hollywood soundstage, I don't have the space to mount any lighting above. Because of this, I'm not able to light the green screen separately from the subject, and I have to have all my lights blasting from the front. So everything with my lighting is a compromise to make the best of this fact. Perhaps in the future I may outgrow this space and move on to something bigger, but for now I will continue to make the best of this space. Something we haven't talked about yet is, what does all this cost? When I add up all of the parts in just my camera rig, there isn't much change from $5,000 dues.
$900 dues? Tobias!
Plus a few grand in lighting. And my setup is still fairly entry level when you think about it. You could spend an awful lot more if you wanted to. But what if you didn't want to spend a lot of money? Something else I'm testing at the moment is another mirrorless camera and wide-angle lens, which is comparable in quality to the GH5 and is less than the cost of a GoPro. Heck. I'm planning a masterclass episode on this setup, so hit that subscribe button if you want to see that low-budget, high-end mixed reality camera setup. In the next Mixed Reality Masterclass episode, we'll start to look at how to actually shoot mixed reality with a moving camera, and we'll take our first look at manual MR composition using live dump mode. It's going to revolutionise the way you use mixed reality and unlock its full potential as a filmmaking tool. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and consider turning notifications on to get notified when the next episode is live. If you have any questions about mixed reality, you can leave them in the comments below, or hit me up on Discord by following the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.
Gonna get you, baby.